It's great to be able to be here with lots of people from all across Europe and other places. I work as a molecular biologist. Today's topic is maybe a surprising one, COVID genomics and the case for Christianity, comparing the logic of microbial genomics, which is what I do for research, and Christian truth claims. What a strange topic. A lot of people will think, how can these things go together? Well, these are strange times at the moment, so I think this opens opportunities for slightly unusual topics. And I'm hoping that maybe this will give you a different perspective on how you think about faith. These are the three main things that I'll be talking about today. So firstly, I'll be talking a bit about the virus that everyone is interested in at the moment, and the molecular causes of the situation. I won't talk too much about that, but if people have questions, I guess I can answer some of those. So welcome everyone who's just joined. It's helpful if you can maybe turn off your videos and sound during the talk, and then we'll get to questions in a bit. The second thing is I want to talk more broadly about the underlying logic that informs the kind of research that people do in microbial genomics. And thirdly, I'll be considering how I think this logic applies to claims that Christians make about Christianity, the core claims. Personally, I've been doing some research on this virus for the last couple of months. I'm working on a paper, and the manuscript should be on bioRxiv if people are particularly interested within about a week, but I won't be talking specifically about that research as it's not quite finished yet. I'll be talking more generally about the underlying logic of evolutionary microbial genomics, which is the field that I research. In undergrad, I also studied philosophy, and I had some interests and some research in the philosophy of biology, and that's what's influencing my thoughts on the underlying logic. And finally, the third part will hopefully be the controversial part, arguing that similar reasoning to that which is used in microbial genomics also applies to questions like, does God exist, and did Jesus rise from the dead? This is an overview of what you'll see about me if you look on the university website, the Technical University of Munich, and below this are some papers that we've published recently just to get a sense. My focus is on overlapping genes in bacteria, but as I said, recently I've been doing some work on the coronavirus. Okay, so quick introduction about the virus that everyone is currently interested in. COVID-19 is the name for the disease, the coronavirus disease, 2019. Whereas SARS-CoV-2, severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, is the virus itself, which is a virus which is very similar to a virus which caused an epidemic, I think approximately 10 years ago, the SARS virus. And we see on the right-hand side a tree showing the similarity of different kinds of coronaviruses. We see down here, hopefully people can see my mouse. This is the beta coronaviruses, and SARS-CoV-2 falls within this, close to these genomes here, the SARS genomes. So this is the focus of my research at the moment, and these are the ones that are particularly associated with various epidemics which have occurred in recent years. Maybe particularly interesting, at least for me, about this virus is how much we know about it and how quickly. And this is possible because today we have the ability to cheaply obtain genomes from patient samples within just a few hours. And this has only really become recent and feasible in very recent years. These are a couple of the machines that are used. There's large-scale machines, as you see on the left, which will produce gigabases and gigabases of data. But you can also, as of really quite recently, just the last few years, you can have very small-scale sequencing of DNA and RNA, which is, for instance, the Oxford Nanopore Minion. So it's possible to do this in a very local way, and this is one reason that we're getting huge amounts of data for this virus, which has not really been possible for an outbreak until very recently. Okay. We've so much data actually that as of yesterday, there was approximately 11,000 genomes, full genome sequences that were available, and this is rapidly increasing each day. So when I started looking at the virus, there's just a few hundred a couple of months ago or so. This is uploaded to a website which any researcher can register for and download genomes for their own research. If you wonder what does the virus look like, in some sense, which is the information inside it, it looks like this. This is the full genome. The virus, 29,903 nucleotides, 29 proteins, depending how you count it. And so my research over the last couple of months has been chopping this genome into pieces, comparing bits of this to other similar genomes, and trying to work out what's the history of this virus. The 29,903 nucleotides are split into regions which code for these different proteins we see here. If you're interested in the details, there's a fantastic overview recently in the New York Times, which is linked there, which tells you a little bit about each of the proteins and what they do and what we know about them. Okay, that was a quick introduction to the virus itself. My interest, I guess, with a philosophical background, is what's the structure of the way that we argue about this? And what's the structure of the theory behind what researchers are doing? And this is the general process that people who research evolutionary microbial genomics are doing. They start with a bunch of sequences produced with something like the machines that I showed you before. And let's say, just as a toy example, we have a few sequences from 4 people, Bob, Ben, Bill, and Bex, and they look like that. These are just little segments of the RNA or DNA that we might see. The next stage in general is that they'd align them. So they work out which bits are similar to which other bits, basically, and do a rigorous comparison with this kind of alignment. That's the second step. The third step is then we build a tree out of the alignment to see, based on the similarities and the alignment, what's the most likely scenario for how these sequences are related to each other. And then the most interesting bit is the last bit. Okay, given this tree, what kinds of things can we say about evolution? About the diversity, the rate of change, the selection, whether there is positive selection, negative selection, whether there's any new novelty, whether there's deletions, parallel evolution. These are the kinds of things that evolutionary biologists are interested in once they've got a tree, which is built up from the original sequences. And this is what hundreds or maybe thousands of people around the world are now doing with the virus sequences. This is a nice example of how do you build this kind of tree. You can build a similar kind of tree if you compare the different kinds of baked goods that you might find in a bakery. And you do that by considering what properties do they share in common with each other and what properties are different or novel. And if you do that carefully, like someone very thoroughly did and posted to Twitter recently, you can get this kind of tree showing in some sense, at least conceptual relationships between the different kinds of bakery items based on whether they contain milk or whether the way that they're baked or their shape or all kinds of things. So you can do something similar like that with organisms. And when you do it with organisms, it gives you a hint of how they're related to each other. But the particularly rigorous way that's possible now is to do this with sequence data. And this makes it a lot kind of less subjective than it might have been otherwise. Okay, so there's a couple of strands of logic. There's firstly the big picture, which is in common for evolution, and some of it is in common for science in general. And then there's secondly, some considerations that are fairly specific to evolutionary biology, which I'll look at next. But the first ones are just the big picture logic. And in a few minutes, I'll be applying these to the more controversial questions of whether God exists and whether Christian claims are true. But to start with, we should think about, well, what kind of logic should we approach things with? And in evolution, something I've thought about is that the case for evolution is really made up of multiple lines of evidence. And what makes it an interesting theory and what makes it successful as an explanation is that there's multiple lines of evidence. One piece of evidence by itself might not be very persuasive at all, but when you look at the stack of things together, then we can start to make rigorous inferences. We can start to really trust the conclusions that we're making. So there's multiple lines of evidence, and also there's different kinds of evidence. So there's sequences, there's phenotypes or biological forms, there's fossils, there's evolutionary models, there's measurements of mutation rates. And these are all the kinds of things that we can plug into evolutionary theory to try and make better explanation of what we see in biology. And so, like I said before, individual pieces of evidence by themselves might not be very persuasive, but that's okay, because it's the overall weight of the evidence stacked up together that matters. And we'll come back to that soon, and hopefully we can discuss how you might think that does or doesn't apply to Christian claims. And I'll give an introduction to that soon. Maybe a crucial principle is what's known as parsimony or simplicity. And that's, and I'll explain that a little bit more soon. And also, explanations should not be ad hoc. They shouldn't be invented just to explain the data. And I'll give an explanation in a minute. So parsimony is a really key principle. It's also known, you've quite possibly heard of Occam's razor from William of Ockham. And that's basically the idea that you shouldn't invent more causes than are required. So where possible, positing one cause is better than positing many. And this is crucial across science and maybe particularly in evolutionary inference. So the same effect, if you see it multiple times, should be explained by a single cause where that seems reasonable. So examples within evolutionary biology are the inferred unity of the tree of life. We think that there's just a single tree that's more parsimonious, and it seems to be enough to explain the data. So where possible, we want to infer just one rather than multiple. Multiple causes or multiple events is more extravagant than just positing one. A second example of the application of Occam's razor is that similarity is taken to imply either common descent or similar selective forces. So if you see similarity across different biological organisms, evolutionary biologists want to infer a single cause. So either it's similar because of descent, or it's similar because of a similar selective pressure. But we don't want to be inventing different causes for every different thing that we see. Otherwise, we just end up with a huge list of causes. We don't really have an explanation or a unified theory. Okay, so that's a really important principle. You can probably apply it in all areas of science, but I think particularly important for evolutionary biology, which is about bringing diverse observations together with simple explanations. So that's parsimony. And the second key principle is that we don't want our explanations to be ad hoc. So that means that an explanation should, at least ideally, not need to be invented to fit the data. Especially, we don't want to be inventing complex explanations for every new piece of data that we find. We want to be reusing explanations that we have some other reason to believe. So an explanation for which there is independent evidence is preferred over one for which we just had to invent on the spot to explain new data. So as a silly example, if I found a mutation in two different virus genomes that were found in, say, Italy and Argentina, which is an example that's happened recently, I could say, well, the reason that these mutations are similar is because aliens placed one in Italy and some other aliens placed the other mutation in Argentina. But I think it's clear that it would be both more parsimonious and less ad hoc to say that there was a single cause of this, and that the single cause of the similarity in mutations is that these viruses are related by descent. And if people have questions about that, we can talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so that was the broad picture, particularly focusing on the cumulative case of the evidence, that it's multiple things stacked up. Parsimony, that simplicity is important, and that we want explanations that are not ad hoc. They're not just invented on the spot. And secondly, there's logic within evolutionary genomics that's fairly specific to this branch of thinking. I think this specific logic will also turn out to be useful a little bit later. So these are the general principles I've tried to come up with. Firstly, that similarity in general, in some sense, implies descent or a common source. And we'll talk about that. Changes or differences in genomes of particular importance are those which are non-functional. If it's non-functional, it means you can't say the reason it changed is for some functional purpose. And I'll give some examples which will hopefully make that a little bit clearer. And a key principle is that something is widespread is probably ancestral. It probably goes back to the beginning. So if we see the same nucleotide in every single coronavirus that we sequence, it's reasonable to think that the very first coronavirus from which these descended also had that nucleotide at that position, as one example. So if I see a mutation that's found in all of these viruses, it's reasonable to think that that mutation goes right back to the beginning, the ancestor that was shared by all of these viruses. And this is the general principle by which we make evolutionary trees, we make evolutionary inferences. That changes that are found across diverse samples ultimately probably have a source and a common ancestor of those samples. Okay. So that was a very quick introduction to the kind of research that I do, evolutionary microbial genomics as applied to viruses and other things. So what relevance is this to Christianity or to claims about religion or faith? So I'm a Christian. I believe that God exists and that Jesus rose from the dead. And I don't just take this as a matter of faith, but I think that evidence is going to be relevant to this question. And I'll try and explain some of the ways that I think about this in terms of three really big questions that anyone who's considering whether Christianity is true should probably be considering. And the first question is, does God exist at all? Is there a God? Is there a personal transcendent source of the universe? And the second question is that, were these Christian stories, were they made up late? Which is a thing that a lot of people kind of have some idea of, that, well, Christianity is just a myth that was kind of invented slowly over time. Is that true? And can the kind of evolutionary inferences, which I've talked about before, can they be of relevance here? And thirdly, did Jesus rise from the dead? Maybe the key claim of Christianity, which Christians believe validates his claims about himself and who he is, that he really did defeat death. So the first question is, does God exist? And do we have any reason to think he does? So again, I'll apply exactly the same logic that I think underlies evolutionary genomics and apply it in the case of God. So multiple lines of evidence can add up to be very strong. There are different kinds of evidence that I think are relevant to the question of whether God exists. And we'll talk through some examples of these. So for instance, metaphysical evidence, scientific evidence, moral evidence, historical evidence, and others. These very diverse classes of evidence, I think, all relevant to the question of whether there's a personal transcendent source behind the universe. And thirdly, individual points might not be decisive. You might not be convinced by one argument or another. But I think what's really important, as with evolutionary theory, is it's about the overall weight of the evidences that you need to keep in mind. So the fact that one argument is only suggestive, it's not conclusive, that's not a reason to think that it's a bad argument or that it's not helpful. And this is true across science, and it's also true here. And again, the crucial principle will be parsimony, I think, or at least one very important principle. What kinds of lines of evidence are there? And each of these could be a lecture in themselves, and I won't give that now. So I'll just very quickly sketch out some things that I think count as evidence for the existence of God. There's metaphysical considerations, there's metaphysical arguments. For instance, the fact the world is contingent, that it seems that it could have been otherwise, this seems to call out for some kind of cause. This is how science works in general. When something happens and it's not necessary, it didn't have to happen, then we want to know, well, why did it happen? The universe happened in some sense, and it looks like it's not necessary. For instance, it seems to have had a beginning. It seems to be changing through time. These are two characteristics of things that are not necessary but contingent. So when something is contingent, this cries out for a cause. The universe seems to be contingent. The universe cries out for a cause. Contingency arguments or cosmological arguments suggest that God is the best kind of cause of that kind of thing. It's just one line of evidence for the existence of God. The scientific evidence, the Laws of physics seem to be fine-tuned. If they were very slightly different, then life as we know it could not exist. This kind of fine-tuning seems to suggest to a lot of people, a fine-tuner, a reason for why the laws are so life-friendly, when everything we know doesn't seem to suggest that that's required in any sense, and seems quite unexpected. Thirdly, cosmic order. The fact that there are laws of nature at all seems very surprising, given naturalism, given the idea that there is no God. And if you want to know more about that, there's a philosopher called Richard Swinburne who has some excellent work on that topic. And there's multiple kinds of arguments just to do with laws of nature. There's moral arguments, and there's a whole class of different moral arguments that we could talk about. So that's a whole huge class of evidence. So moral duties seem to require foundation, and they also seem to require the fact we have knowledge about them seems to require some explanation. The applicability of mathematics to the physical universe are also surprising, if there's no mind behind the universe. And as bonus evidence, which I'll touch on soon, the facts about Jesus and history seem to need some explanation. So these are just some of the kinds of things that seem to me to be evidence that God exists. And as in the case of evolutionary theory, you can stack different pieces of evidence together, and together form, I think, a very strong case. But when stacking evidence together, when considering explanations, I think we need to keep in mind parsimony as one principle in particular, just as we did with evolutionary genomics. So on the left-hand side, I've listed some things that I think need to be explained. And the way that naturalism explains them is basically each of them, I think on naturalism, the idea that there is no God, needs to be treated separately. There's no single unifying source of all these things. They're just, whatever the naturalistic explanation is, it's unique to that particular class of evidence. So moral knowledge, or the existence of moral facts, or other moral classes of evidence will need some kind of explanation. But it's hard to see on naturalism how that would be the same kind of explanation as the thing that explains cosmic order or laws of nature. Sorry, I've got moral knowledge twice. But the other things that we saw on the previous slide, applicability of mathematics, the fine-tuned laws, etc. So each of these needs explanation. And on naturalism, they're hanging independently in midair without a single unifying explanation. Whereas on theism, the idea that God exists, we have all these things that I think seem to be hanging together in a unified personal source, which is God. And in my view, that's a bonus for the God explanation. That's something which is good and helpful, and should give us some reason to believe that God is a better explanation, because it's a unified source rather than a bunch of different unconnected things. So the parsimonious explanation is to start with a single transcendent personal being who can explain all these different facts, rather than trying to explain each fact with its own special kind of, I would say, ad hoc kind of explanation. That's parsimony. And secondly, it's really important, and I think a lot of people have not realized this, that Christianity is not ad hoc. Christianity wasn't invented to explain facts about fine-tuning, or facts about morality, or contingency, or these other interesting philosophical or metaphysical things. Claims about the Christian God arose because of completely independent historical realities. They're based in history, they're based in personal experiences. So Christianity is not an ad hoc invention. We have good independent reason, or the early Christians at least had very good independent reason to believe Christian claims, because they had met Jesus personally, and they had seen that he had risen from the dead. It turns out that these claims also help to make sense of all these things in arguments that I could develop in detail. But that wasn't the reason that the concept of the Christian God was invented. And that's a huge bonus, I think. That means this is not just a made up story that was made to somehow fit the data. And people believed in God well before they knew about fine-tuning or moral arguments or that kind of thing. So that's a real bonus for Christian claims. Okay, then not only this general kind of philosophy of science stuff can be applied to Christian claims, but also the more specific situation of evolutionary biology. So these are just the things that I've listed before. That similarity implies descent, that non-functional changes are particularly important, widespread features are probably ancestral. So I think we can apply these to Christianity. How do we do that? Well, it's a discipline that's called text criticism, and I'll talk a little bit about this, which is how do we know what the original Christian claims were? How do we know what the original Gospels, for instance, had in them? Were the Gospels changed many times over hundreds of years, as a lot of people believe? This is a quote from Bart Ehrman, who's a very skeptical, non-Christian scholar. And he says in the back of one of his books, he's interviewed about one of his mentors who was a Christian. And he says, even though we may disagree on important religious questions, his mentor, Bruce Metzger, is a firmly committed Christian, and I'm not. We're in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. If they were put in a room and asked to work out what the original text of the New Testament was, he says that there'd be very few points of disagreement. And I won't quote the whole thing, but that's because of the number of manuscripts that we have. We can trace the history of the text in such that we can be confident in what the original text says, in a way that's actually quite similar to the way we trace the history of genomes. So there are quite a few variants, but most of them are spelling variants in the different manuscripts that we have, and only about 1% of the New Testament text is affected by things that are not minor spelling variants. So something like 99% of the text is known with incredibly high confidence, because we can trace back from the variations that we see to what the original must most probably have been. Now, in this area, particularly important are changes in the text that are mistakes, because these are fairly obvious, spelling mistakes and things, and when they're shared, this helps us to trace specifically how manuscripts are related to each other, and that helps us have more confidence in what the original would have been when we can start to trace the chains of transmission. So this is a scene from Mr. Bean where he's copying in an exam, and anyone who's been a lecturer or tutor and has marked people's work will know that sometimes cheating does happen. One of the best ways to catch cheating is to see mistakes that are shared between different students' work. So mistakes are particularly helpful for tracing the history of texts, because they don't have a separate explanation. They don't have an explanation of intention or functionality. Instead, they're best explained in terms of shared history. And this is the same for the Gospels as it is for exams, as it is for genomes as well. So in general, we have what could be called a phylogenetics, or a genetic history of the text. So in a similar way to which we can trace the origins of a virus by shared mutations, we can trace the history of different chains of transmission of Bible texts by tracing their shared differences. So that's one example where evolutionary logic, evolutionary analysis can be applied in quite a direct way to something that's really important to Christian claims, which is the question of whether we have any sense of what the original New Testament manuscripts said. The second and final thing I want to briefly talk about is, did Jesus rise from the dead? And do these kinds of inferences or logic, do they help us in considering this? And for me, what's really important here is that in assessing this question, we have multiple independent early sources, which are from quite separate strands of, they're from different places, or they're from very different people, different contexts. So one example of this that I like is the most quoted Old Testament verse in the New Testament is from the Psalm 110, verse 1. And this portion of the Psalm is used often in the New Testament in talking about Jesus' resurrection, that he has conquered death, is the message that this little text is used to portray. And the fact that this is a psalm, for scholars of this, suggests that this thing, which is so widespread, it's found through most New Testament books, it's found in lots of places from lots of different authors, suggests this must go right back to the very beginning, the early Jewish believers, because this is from the Hebrew Bible. So this belief in the resurrection is found in this most cited Old Testament text in the New Testament that suggests it goes right back to the very beginning. Another early source, completely independent of this, is that we have early creeds. So early kind of poems that Paul in his letters seems to be quoting, for instance, in Philippians 2 and 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So this is another early source which scholars believe goes back to even before Paul was writing his letters, and he was writing about 20 or so years after Jesus was crucified. Paul's letters themselves are kind of separate to the creeds which Paul is quoting. The Gospel of Mark is early and is again a separate source. Acts 2 and Acts 13 from the historian Luke are quoting very early speeches by Christian leaders. So these are all different independent Christian leaders who've written or said things that have been recorded. And these provide us with at least 5 or so very early sources which clearly state belief in the resurrection of Jesus. Because these sources are in different places, different writings by different people, that strongly suggests that the belief in the resurrection must go back extremely early. This is not just a later made-up story. Okay. So the multiple early sources are strong evidence that belief in the resurrection of Jesus goes right back to the earliest followers in Jerusalem who knew him personally. The parsimonious or the simplest explanation of this wealth of early evidence for belief in the resurrection, I would say, is that these diverse claims have a single original source in Jerusalem and the disciples, the followers of Jesus who knew him personally, very early after Jesus had been crucified. Okay, so in conclusion, this is what I wanted to say today, and I hope you'll have questions about it. The logic of a cumulative evidential case of parsimony or simplicity, of non-ad hoc explanations that is found in evolutionary theory that's crucial to it, also supports a strong case for the existence of God. That's my first point. The second is that the logic and the principles of phylogenetics, or evolutionary trees, help us to accurately trace the history of genomes, but also the history of the Bible's text. And because of these methods, which are actually applied, people are applying actually the same software that I would run to build trees, they can apply similar software to trace the history of New Testament texts. Because of this kind of analysis, we can have confidence that we know most of the original texts of the New Testament in particular. And lastly, belief in Jesus' resurrection goes right back to the very beginnings of the Christian movement. And the question for you and for everyone really is what explains that fact the best. Okay, if you want to find out more about my research or contact me, you can do that there. Thanks to my friend Samuel Watkinson, who helped me with some of the claims that I made. This was just a very brief introduction to things that are really important and worth looking into. And there's heaps of resources out there now, and you've got lots of time because of coronavirus. So I encourage you all to spend some time actually looking into these questions. And there's different angles that different people are interested in. So I encourage you to work out what's the aspect that you're most interested in and just spend some time looking into it.